Okay, we are going to continue tonight with learning about time and space from a Torah perspective, from different stories in the Torah, different teachings. And the next time we meet, we are going to move these ideas, especially about space, into discussing Eretz Yisrael, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, the specialness of Eretz Yisrael. So that's the direction that we are going. Last week, we did the first class about time and space. And a few people noticed that in our weekly email, it was not posted. It will be posted this week along with this class. So both classes about time and space will be posted when we send out the email, which is usually on Wednesday. Okay, so I've picked out a number of different ideas about time and space. It's not necessarily like one flow of one idea. There's many, many different ideas, different aspects of time and space, especially the unity between them, as taught over in the Torah. As we mentioned last week, the idea that time and space are intrinsically woven together is a so-called new discovery. Albert Einstein was the one who revealed the space-time continuum, the enmeshed reality of time and space in physical reality. And so we're looking at different aspects of time and space, and especially their unity according to the Torah. So last week we mentioned the idea from Sefer Yetzirah called Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. World, Olam, Shana is year, Nefesh is soul. Translated is space, time, and consciousness. And we discussed that at great length. And also the idea that at Har Sinai, at the giving of the Torah, that it says that the whole mountain was full of ashan, full of smoke. Ashan actually means smoke, but as an acronym, so it's Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. And this indicates that at the giving of Har Sinai was a mass mystical, spiritual experience by everyone there, where all the different dimensions merged together in a way that in ordinary circumstances we cannot perceive. So what's interesting, this is pointed out by Rabbi Ginsburg, is that the word for time in Hebrew is zman. That's the most used word for time is zman. And he points out something very interesting, that the three letters of zman, the zayin, so it stands for zman, which means time. The mem is for makom, place. And the nun is for nefesh. So here it's very interesting. In time itself, you have time, space, and consciousness. So the Sefer Yetzirah was absolutely prophetic in understanding the nature of the universe far before science was able to come up with formulas and realizations acknowledging the unity of time and space. So another beautiful connection of time and space is in consciousness, soul. And this is also pointed out by Rabbi Ginsburg, that in the account of creation and in the creation of mankind, the word one appears 3 different times. The first time is at the end of the first day. Vayhi erev, vayhi boker, yom echad. It was evening and it was morning, one day. Everyone points out, it doesn't say the first day, it says one day. meaning that, and this is recounted by Rashi and all the other commentators, the idea that everything that would ever be created was already created on the first day. And then it just unfolded. And Rashi says that each day, different things are said to have been created. But he makes the point that really everything was created, we'll call it in potential, on the first day. That's in the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the heavens represent all spiritual phenomena, and the earth represents all physical phenomena. And the concept of the Big Bang says the same thing, is that in the original point that explodes and the universe is still expanding from that original bang, that everything was there, just like in a seed. We discussed this last week, just like you take a redwood tree seed and you put it in the ground, and you come back 100 years later and you have a 350-foot tree. Well, the whole tree was in the seed. So on the first day, it's called, it was evening, it was morning, one day. So that's time, one day. The next time the word one appears is on the third day of creation, where God, we imagine that the earth was covered by water. And it says that God gathered the waters to one place and revealed the earth. And there it says to one place. So now we have time and we have place. And then after Chava is separated from Adam, so it says immediately afterwards, therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. We discussed this last week. This idea, one flesh, can mean one of two things, either through marital intimacy, they become quite literally one, or a child that is born from that union is the one flesh that comes from the union of two people. So here we have one day, one place, one flesh. Here we have time, place, space, and nefesh. So all of these are just showing that this concept of the unity of time and space, but here we're adding the chiddush here is also that consciousness, soul, is a dimension. And so, as I mentioned last week, anyone can Google the role of consciousness in modern physics today, or in quantum physics. And you'll see the cutting edge of quantum physics now is trying to understand and has already acknowledged the incredibly important role of consciousness in determining reality. So now we have a few ideas. Now we're going to go to the story of Yosef as a dream interpreter. We know that Yosef, when he was in jail, so the butler and the baker, he offered to interpret their dreams. And the baker, he dreamt of 3 loaves of bread, and the butler dreamt of 3 bunches of grapes. And the number 3 repeats itself actually in the dream a number of times. Later, when Paro has his dreams, So he dreams of 7 stalks of grain, and then healthy ones, and then 7 not healthy ones come and consume them. And the same thing with 7 very healthy cows, and then very unhealthy cows consume them, but looked as terrible as they looked before. So here we see in the dreams of Yosef, you see the number 3 and the number 7. Now, what's interesting is Paro saw entities in space. He saw cows, he saw grain. These are not entities of time. And the butler and baker, they saw loaves of bread, and they saw grapes and bunches of grapes. And yet, Yosef interprets the physical objects as symbolic of time. That's why he said to the baker, in 3 days, Paro will come and hang you. And he said to the butler, in 3 days, Paro will return you to your previous position. And with Paro, we know he interpreted the 7 sickly grains and cows as 7 years of famine. And the healthy grain and cows is 7 years of first the plenty, and then being consumed by a famine. So this is, again, a Torah from Rabbi Ginsburg, who says that this was not just intuitive, but Yosef understood the unity of time and space. And therefore, he interpreted objects of space in space as periods of time. And what was different, because we're told in the Torah, it says that no one could interpret his dreams, Paro's dreams. But the Midrash says that it's not true. They did interpret his dreams, but Pharaoh intuitively understood that these are not the right interpretations. One interpretation said you'll have 7 daughters and they will all die. And another interpretation is you will conquer 7 armies, 7 nations, and then they will conquer you. And so his wise men interpreted the physical objects as symbolizing other physical objects, armies or nations or daughters, whereas Yosef interpreted them as time. So Rav Ginsburg just pointed out that this was somewhat prophetic. It was prophetic that he could interpret the dreams, but more than that, that he had the sense to interpret it, physical objects as periods of time. So that's a very, very interesting concept. Now, I want to mention, as I said, we're just going through different ideas about time and space, especially the unification. So in science, they talk about the arrow of time. What does this mean? And it's a tremendous mystery in science, because now that time is conceived as a dimension. So the dimensions of space, go in both directions. Height, width, and length go in 2 directions. But time only goes in one direction. It's called the arrow of time. And that's why there's countless books and discussions and movies about time travel, going back into time. Right now, as far as anyone has figured out, we cannot go back in time. Time goes only in one direction. So the mystery in science really is, well, if it's a dimension, why can't you go back in time? Maybe someday they will figure out a way to go back in time. But what I want to point out something which is very interesting, because we're talking about dimensions of time, space, and soul, consciousness. So in the mind, we go back and forth in time all the time. In fact, I would imagine during this class, many of us will be going back and forth in time, meaning we kind of space out a little bit, daydream a little, and we're back in the past. Some great event, some terrible event, some inner hurt, something that a teacher will say, which will remind them of what they learned in the past. And our mind has no problem going back into the past. Same thing with the future. We're future tripping all the time, even though we don't know exactly what will happen, but we're making plans for the future all the time. We're looking at our watches all the time because in 10 minutes I need to be there. And we imagine being there. Or like I said, we future trip. So here we see that maybe physically, yet we can only go according to the arrow of time in one direction. But in our minds, we, like I said, we're constantly going back and forth, back and forth. Even, let's say in Kiddush. So we say, Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, a remembrance of the time of creation. And we also say, Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of going out of Egypt. Or let's take the Seder of Pesach. So the whole thing is to visualize ourselves being in the past. But like I said, we have no problem. We do this all the time. All the time we're slipping into the past, especially emotionally, constantly. And we're also, anyone who works on a project, we have to make deadlines and you have to manage your time. You have to figure out the future already in the present. So that's another just very, very interesting idea. I'm hoping that I'm just sparking different ideas or interest about this subject. Now we're going to go into another idea, and that is as we know, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. And most of the Muslims also have a lunar calendar. Our calendar is a little bit different because a Muslim calendar in Islam is purely lunar, which means it's a 354-day year. The solar year is 365 and a quarter days, to be exact, year. And the Jewish calendar is basically a lunar calendar. But as this year, we'll be adding a leap month, because we have to keep the solar and the lunar calendars in sync. For one reason that the Torah brings is Pesach must be in the spring. And if it was a purely lunar calendar, that would not be true. That's why in Islam, Ramadan, because the year is 11 days shorter. So every 3 years, it's a month difference. So Ramadan can be December, it can be November, it could be October, it goes around. But our calendar, Pesach, must be in the spring. So 7 times in every 19 years, we add a leap year. So my first thought I want to share is it's interesting just to note that we count time, we record a lunar year by the movement of the moon, the waxing and waning of the moon, which is in space. And yet, that is our indication of how we count time. And it would be the same thing with the solar year. So that's just also just it's just a fact. That's how we figure out how to count time, is by the movement in space of the luminaries. So that again points to the ultimate unity of time and space. Now, we mentioned that 7 times in every 19 years is a leap month. So Rav Ginsburg explains that the number 19 is the gematria of Chava, the first woman. Chava, her gematria is 19. And so therefore, in a very deep way, time is connected to a feminine energy. We know that the moon is considered a feminine energy, especially the waxing and the waning of the moon is very connected to a woman's biological cycle, especially the menstruation cycle. They're very, very connected. And so here we see in a number of different ways that time is very connected to the feminine. So we'll go a little bit deeper here, because in modern Hebrew, the word for experience is chavaya, which comes from the word chava. Having an experience is a feminine concept in a sense. And if you look at the story of the Garden of Eden, so the snake tells Chava, if you eat from this fruit, you'll be like God. You will know the difference between good and evil. And then it says that Chava saw the fruit, and it was beautiful in appearance, and it seemed good to eat. So here we could see the idea of experience being based on the word Chava. Is she wanted the experience of being like God. So Chassidut explains, even though it was considered a mistake, a sin, but on a very deep level, Chava wanted to be like God. And she was drawn into the experience, and therefore it's connected to the word Chava. Now, another way we could see the connection of women with time is in Parshat Vayishlach. At the end of Parshat Vayishlach, there's the whole accounting of 8 kings that ruled in Edom before there was a king in Israel. And according to the Zohar, according to the Ari, this is hiding some of the greatest secrets in the Torah, especially the whole idea of Shvirat HaKelim. Because it says each one of the kings ruled and died, ruled and died, ruled and died. And this is explained in the Zohar and the Ari, especially the Ari, that each one of these kings is one of the Sfirot, and each one of the kings tried to rule by themselves, but they died. In other words, the Sfirot shattered. This is what's called Shvirat HaKelim in the world of Tohu. And then it comes to the 8th king, and whose name was Hadar, and it mentions his wife, Mehetavel. None of the other kings does it mention their wives, only by the 8th king. Now we know 8 always stands for 1 above the 7. And so the 8th king, Hadar and Mehetavel, allude to tikkunim, rectifications that will happen only at the time of Mashiach. and especially the unity of male and female. Now, the name Mehetavel equals 97 equals time, Zman. Mehetavel equals Zman, equals time. So without going into deeper about these 8 kings, but here's another allusion to the connection of women with time. Now, having said that, though, we know in the what's called the teaching of inter-inclusion that anytime you talk about chesed, there's going to be an aspect of the other sphira. We do this in the Sphira Omer every week. Chesed sheba chesed, gevura sheba chesed, teferet sheba chesed, and continuing. So the same thing, even if you have all these different ideas and illusions and almost obvious connections of women with time, women also have a very deep connection to space. And that is because the Chachma is always called father, wisdom is called father, and Bina is called understanding, mother. And the imagery, the symbolism is, and they're called two beloveds that never separate. And of course, father and mother represent a marital couple and a union of male and female, of Chachma and Bina. So Chachma is called like the seed, and Bina is the womb where the seed is developed. And so for the 9 months of pregnancy, this is a very spatial idea here, is that the seed is developed in a spatial dimension through the woman. It's the woman that nurtures the baby into being. And there's a verse that says, that connects Bina with space. I believe it's in Mishlei. Where is the place of Bina? And there are verses that connect Chachma to time. So this idea of inter-inclusion is mentioned everywhere in Chassidut and Kabbalah. Rav Ginsburg has invested enormous amounts of energy in teaching over how to be able to see the inter-inclusion of everything. Whatever you're talking about, if you think it's just only this one thing, then it's one-dimensional. You always have to look deeper and see what is inter-included in it. So Rav Ginsburg gives over another very interesting idea relating to time and space. And he says that today, when you talk in science, now we're not talking about the 4 forces of the physical universe, which is the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and gravity. But he was saying that there are 2 unities that make up virtually all scientific inquiry now. And that is time and space, and matter and energy. These are the 2 unities. And he explains that the higher unity is time and space. That's Chachma and Bina. And energy and matter are the Vav and the Hey. So the Yud is Chachma, the Hey is Bina, that's time and space. And as we said, wisdom and understanding, Chachma and Bina, are called 2 beloveds that never separate. And what's, in a sense, the lower unity is energy, which is the Vav, which are the 6 lower sphirot, and then matter is malchut, is the seventh. So here we see in God's name there's two unities. There's the higher unity, and this is sometimes referred to in the Shema. The Shema is called the higher unity, and Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam, it is called the lower unity. They're both unities, but relative one to the other, one is higher and one is lower. So that is very has a lot to think about, how the four letters of God's name relate to time, space, energy, and matter. Now, with the time left, I want to try to develop one more subject, and that is the connection of time and space, but mostly time to Shabbat. So we'll start with a Torah from the Netivat Shalom, from the Slonim Rabbi. And he says a beautiful thing, a very, very beautiful thing. And it's easy to visualize. So in the Torah, God says to Moshe, after he's built the tabernacle, the Mishkan, he says that I will speak to you from between the kruvim, the two cherubs that were placed on the cover of the ark that was kept in the Holy of Holies. God says, when I speak to you, my voice, however you want to understand it, my communication will emanate from between the kruvim. And so the Slonim Rebbe says, well, we don't have a temple anymore. We don't have the kruvim. So how does God talk to us? So he takes the verse, for those who are familiar, in Kabbalah Shabbat. Now Chabad doesn't say this passage, but this passage is repeated by virtually everyone else right before the Amidah of Friday night. And it's called Vishamru. Vishamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, Sodat Shabbat, L'dorotam Brit Olam, Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam. So this is what the Slonim Rebbe, it's describing Shabbat, but it says it's between me, Beini, Ubein b'nei Yisrael, between me and the children of Israel, an everlasting sign, Shabbat. So the Slonim Rebbe says, just like God used to speak to us spatially from between the kruvim, he now speaks to us between Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti olam. In other words, God is speaking to us in Shabbos. That, like we talk about the temple being a sanctuary in place, in space, Shabbat is a sanctuary in time. So here is another very deep connection between time and space. And we see it in actually the halacha, because we know that there are 39 major categories of work that we don't do on Shabbat. Where do we learn that from? We learn it from the 39 major categories of work that were done to make the Mishkan. So in other words, the halachas of Shabbat, what we don't do, is learned from what we do to make the Mishkan, to make the tabernacle. And so we don't have a tabernacle. We have the Beit Knesset, that's for sure, and we have our homes. So that's where I wanted to connect the time and space, because on Shabbat, we turn our homes into a sanctuary. Now, in truth, our homes are always our sanctuary, but there's no doubt on Shabbat, we make special efforts to make our home a fitting vehicle for the energy of Shabbat. We put a special tablecloth on, we bring out our best dishes, we get flowers. By many people, they have sweet smelling herbs or flowers, make a blessing over it. We eat the best food, we dress in the best clothes, we clean our houses. So we turn our houses into a sanctuary in space. But Shabbos, in a sense, is happening in the dimension of time. But here we see the unity of that. Now, without going into it, but this is very important, and we mentioned it last week, is in science, in physics, when we talk about the physical world, so in a sense, the most important part of any formula is light. And E equals mc squared. In other words, the unity of energy and matter is connected with time and light. So it's very, very significant. And first of all, how do we usher in the Shabbat? So here, again, there's a very specific time that we bring in Shabbat. It's not like any time you want. When the sun goes down, Shabbat begins. But women have the special privilege of lighting candles and ushering in the Shabbat. And everyone knows that most women make this kind of emotion as if bringing infinite light into finite reality, bringing godliness, spirituality, an extra soul into Shabbat. And so we begin Shabbat with light, and we end Shabbat with light. In Havdalah, one of the most important ingredients of Havdalah is lighting light. So the significant idea here is that the numerical value of Shabbat is 702, and the inverse number 702 is 207, which equals light, or it also equals Ein Sof, infinite. And so that's why we say that Shabbat is a 60th of the world to come. It's a taste of the infinite experience of the world to come. So here we see Shabbat and light, 702 and 207. And in almost every synagogue in the world, you have what's called the Ner Tamid, the everlasting light. That is in different, many times it's over the, where the ark is kept, where the Torah is kept. Sometimes it's in other places, but virtually every synagogue in the world has what's called the Ner Tamid, an everlasting light. It represents the menorah. It represents the idea of God's constant light. And so the numerical value of Ner Tamid, an ongoing light, a continual light, equals Bishabbat. In the Shabbat is this idea of bringing infinite light into finite reality. So one other idea is in Lecha Dodi, we say Sof Maaseh b'machshava techila. The end of doing of God's creation is first in thought. So this is referring to the Shabbat. But where do we see it in the text? In other words, Shabbat is the seventh day. It's the end of creation. So Sof Ma'aseh. But God had in mind the end already at the beginning. And that's why we say in the Amida that Shabbat it's the Tachlit. In a certain ways, they're both true, but there's this 6 days of work culminating in the Shabbat. So you'd say, well, which is the Ikar here? Which is the most important? So the answer is both, because we're commanded, Sheshet Yamin Taseh Melachtecha. 6 days you shall do your work. So it's positive, it's good. And we're also commanded to keep Shabbat. But in one hand, you could say that the 6 days are the Ikar, and the Shabbat, we rest from those endeavors. But on a deeper level, Shabbat is the Tachlit. Shabbat is the purpose. And we even say it in the Amida, that Shabbat is the Tachlit of Shemayim and the Aretz. It's the main point. So here, if you look in the first word of the Torah, Bereshit. So first of all, the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, has 6 letters, and the first verse has 7 words. So already you have engraved in creation the idea of 6 days of work, crowned by the culminating Shabbat. But in the word Bereshit, you have the word Shabbat. Yirah Shabbat, the awe of Shabbat. So when we say the end of deed is the first in thought, already in the word Bereshit, you have the word Shabbat. Yirah Shabbat, the awe of Shabbat. So I think we will try to put this all together in a blessing. And the blessing is that we should make all of our time quality time. We should make the most of the time that we have. We should make time work for us, be our best friend. And we should realize that our environment, now this is from our homes, our synagogues, our earth, that the way we treat it is the way it's going to come back at us. So not only should we make the best of our time, but we should make the best of the beautiful world that God gave us, from, like I said, the smallest environment to taking care of the entire world.